Nestled in the heart of suburbia, the neighborhood stood as a picture-perfect example of community living. Tree-lined streets wound through rows of well-kept homes, each painted in soothing pastels or elegant earth tones, creating a cheerful and inviting landscape. Children played outside, their laughter echoing as they rode bicycles up and down driveways, while parents exchanged friendly nods and smiles. However, beneath this charming facade lay the intricate web of homeowners association (HOA) rules that dictated much of life in the community. The HOA, a self-governing body comprised of residents, was meant to maintain property values and ensure that the neighborhood remained a desirable place to live. To that end, it enforced various regulations regarding landscaping, architectural designs, and even the colors residents could paint their front doors. While many appreciated the order these guidelines provided, others chafed under what they perceived as overreach. This distinction became particularly evident with the emergence of Karen, the HOA president. Known for her unwavering dedication to enforcing every rule, often with exaggerated zeal, she quickly earned a reputation for being both notorious and feared among the residents. To her, rules were not mere suggestions but commandments that must be followed without question. Her obsession with compliance often led to whispered tales of her interactions with neighbors who dared deviate from the established norm. Despite being an outsider, I had recently moved into this neighborhood rental and was blissfully unaware of the monster lurking in the HOA's leadership. My attention was drawn not only to the pristine gardens but also to the palpable tension within the community surrounding its rules. As I settled in and got accustomed to my new surroundings, little did I know that crossing paths with Karen would set off a chain of events that would unravel this seemingly perfect suburban life. Karen, the president of the Homeowners Association, was a figure who seemed to thrive on control and order. With a perfectly coiffed bob and meticulously chosen attire, always featuring pastel colors that matched the neighborhood, she embodied the suburban ideal on the surface. However, her smile seldom reached her eyes. Beneath that polished exterior lay a rigid enforcer obsessed with rules and regulations. At every community meeting, Karen commanded attention, often launching into passionate monologues about the importance of compliance. Her voice had a sharp edge, laced with a tone that brooked no argument. It was clear she relished her authority, using the HOA as her personal platform to wield power over the lives of residents. She would frequently circulate memos outlining new rules or amendments to existing ones, punctuated with cheerful but condescending phrases reminding everyone of their obligations. The residents had learned to navigate around her antics. Some would chuckle in hushed tones about her infamous drive-by inspections, where she would patrol the neighborhood as if on a mission to identify even the slightest infractions, such as an untrimmed hedge or an improperly placed garden gnome. Others steered clear of confrontation altogether, adopting a passive approach to avoid her wrath. Those who dared challenge her authority often recounted unfortunate experiences involving public reprimands at meetings or impromptu visits filled with passive-aggressive commentary. Despite this, there were whispers of discontent. Many felt that Karen's rigid enforcement crossed into unreasonable territory, stifling individual flair and creativity in their homes. As I settled into my new rental, I couldn't help but notice this air of unease among neighbors when discussing HOA matters. What remained unknown to me at that point was just how deeply Karen's obsession with power would affect me directly in the coming days. It all began one sunny Saturday morning when I was in my backyard, tending to some overgrown shrubbery. As I pruned the unruly branches, I glanced toward the fence separating my property from my neighbor's yard. It was then that I noticed something odd, a slight encroachment of her pristine garden onto my side of the boundary, creating a visual clash between our distinct landscapes. Unbeknownst to me, this seemingly trivial observation would ignite Karen's interest like a moth to a flame. Just as I was about to return to my gardening, I spotted her approaching from down the street, clipboard in hand and wearing that unnervingly cheerful expression that often masked her true intentions. She clearly had been conducting one of her inspections and, within moments, she zeroed in on me. "Good morning," she chirped, though her tone suggested she was anything but pleased. "I couldn't help but notice a few issues with your property line," she continued, gesturing towards the overlapping plants with an exaggerated wave of her arm. "We need to ensure that everyone adheres strictly to HOA guidelines." What began as a light-hearted chat quickly evolved into a tense exchange. I informed her that I had just moved in and wasn't even part of the HOA, emphasizing that I didn't see it as a significant problem. Yet her eyes narrowed slightly at my dismissal. That singular moment sparked something in Karen, a mixture of disbelief and indignation at someone daring to stand their ground against her authority. As our conversation unfolded, it became apparent that this small disagreement over shrubbery would set off an unexpected chain reaction within Karen's meticulous world, and little did I know how deeply it would impact my life in this seemingly serene neighborhood. As Karen continued to press her point about the property boundary, I could feel a rising tide of frustration. It was evident that she expected compliance without question, but something inside me shifted. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to say. "Karen," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not a member of the HOA. I don't see any reason for you to come onto my property." The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, Karen seemed momentarily taken aback. Her cheerful facade flickered as she processed my words, and I could see a flash of disbelief in her eyes. "But as president of the HOA," she retorted sharply, "I have the responsibility to ensure that all properties adhere to community standards. This is a serious issue." I could feel my heart racing as I held my ground. "I understand your position, but this is my private property, and I don't believe there's an actual problem here. If you would like to discuss it, we can do so from our respective sides of the fence." The firmness in my tone surprised even me, but there was something liberating about standing up to her. Karen's expression morphed into one of barely restrained anger, and her clipboard trembled slightly in her grip. "You need to understand that these rules are for the benefit of the entire community." She snapped back, her voice rising slightly. "I get that," I replied evenly, "but you have no authority over me or my yard." With that statement hanging in the air, the atmosphere between us shifted once again. It became a battleground of wills rather than a simple discussion about landscaping. The denouement of that moment was clear. I had ignited something within Karen that would unleash consequences beyond what either of us could have anticipated. Karen's reaction was immediate and explosive, her carefully maintained composure shattering like glass. For a moment, her cheerful facade faded entirely, replaced by a seething anger that seemed to radiate from her. "You have some nerve to talk to me like that," she spat, crossing her arms defensively over her clipboard. Her face flushed a deep shade of crimson, betraying the sense of entitlement she wielded. Her initial surprise soon transformed into a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "You may not think you're part of this community," she began, glaring at me with narrowed eyes, "but whether you like it or not, you are subject to HOA rules. If we let one property slide, what does that mean for everyone else?" Her voice dripped with authority, forcibly invoking the collective spirit of the neighborhood to trap me in her web of manipulation. Karen quickly shifted tactics, attempting to appeal to my sense of responsibility as a neighbor. "This is about maintaining property values," she insisted, pointing dramatically toward the encroaching garden. "If we allow one thing to go unchecked, it opens the floodgates for more violations. Think about your neighbors. They expect adherence to these standards." But I stood firm against her onslaught, recognizing that this was not merely about property lines but rather an embodiment of her struggle for dominance over anyone who dared defy her. With each word she shouted, I could feel her desperation grow. Karen was losing her grip on the narrative. As our verbal clash continued, I saw how deeply rooted her sense of entitlement ran. She genuinely believed that enforcing the rules gave her power over everyone's lives. In this moment of confrontation, she revealed herself more clearly than ever, a woman clinging desperately to control in a world where not everyone bowed before her authority. As the confrontation lingered in the air, Karen's frustration quickly morphed into a calculated escalation of her tactics. Realizing that my denial had undermined her authority, she pivoted sharply, determined to rally support from the other residents to bolster her position. Without missing a beat, she turned on her heel and stormed down the street, clipboard still in hand, seeking out anyone who might back her cause. It wasn't long before I noticed her speaking animatedly with a few neighbors gathered by the mailbox. I could hear snippets of her exaggerated claims as she painted our disagreement as a dire threat to the community's well-being. "If we allow one person to disregard HOA guidelines," she insisted, "what's next? This is how neighborhoods fall apart." Her voice carried a sense of urgency that seemed to ignite worry among those listening. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had lived in the area for decades, nodded sagely at Karen's rhetoric. It was evident that many residents harbored an ingrained respect for her authority, despite her overreaching tendencies. Soon enough, several homeowners approached their front yards, curious about the commotion. Karen seized the moment, exploiting their intrigue and weaving them into her narrative. "Can you believe this?" she exclaimed dramatically, gesturing toward my yard. "We need to stand together and protect our community standards. If we let this slide, it sets a dangerous precedent." A chorus of murmurs arose from the small crowd that began to gather, a mixture of concern and agreement. Feeling the tide turning against me, I realized that Karen was not just fighting for property lines, she was waging a battle for control over how this community defined itself. The power dynamics had shifted palpably, and I braced myself for the fallout from this escalating situation. As I watched her animate the group with tales of impending chaos if I wasn't brought into line, it struck me just how far she would go to maintain her grip on authority, and how much this conflict would test both my resolve and my place within this neighborhood. Amidst the growing commotion stirred by Karen's rallying cries, I felt a surge of resolve crystallizing within me. As she animatedly gestured to the audience she had gathered, I steadied my breath and reminded myself to remain calm. I could see her trying to manipulate the narrative, to make me appear as the villain upending community harmony, but I was determined not to give in to her intimidation tactics. Stepping forward, I raised my voice just enough to cut through the murmurs. "I appreciate that everyone cares about our neighborhood," I said clearly and firmly, forcing myself to maintain eye contact with Karen despite the crowd's growing interest. "But let's not forget that these properties are our own. While rules are important, they should not come at the expense of an individual's rights." As I spoke, I glanced around at my neighbors. Some wore expressions of confusion, while others seemed swayed by Karen's theatrics. I needed to anchor myself in my conviction. "There's nothing wrong with healthy discussions about property management," I continued, "but what we can't allow is for one person's authority to overshadow our personal rights as homeowners." Karen's face was a mask of disbelief mixed with indignation as she struggled for a retort. My refusal to back down began to chip away at the confidence she usually exuded. I could sense that my words were starting to resonate. Several neighbors exchanged glances that hinted at a flicker of doubt regarding her stance. In that moment, despite the momentum Karen had tried to build against me, I realized the importance of standing my ground. This wasn't merely about shrubs or property lines, it was about asserting oneself against an authority that had become more oppressive than protective. As my heart raced with adrenaline, I embraced the challenge ahead, prepared for whatever consequences might follow from this unfolding confrontation. It was time to reclaim my space, not just in the yard but within the very fabric of this community. As the tense confrontation unfolded, the residents' reactions began to reveal the deeper divides within the community. Some neighbors, like Mrs. Thompson, initially loyal to Karen, had expressions of concern mixed with skepticism. "I didn't realize it had gotten this far," she whispered to another neighbor, her loyalty wavering as she observed the escalating tensions. On the other hand, a group of younger homeowners, disillusioned by Karen's overreach, began to exchange knowing glances. They had long suspected that her strict enforcement of rules was less about community welfare and more about exerting control over their small world. "We shouldn't just accept everything she says," one of them murmured, the doubt in her tone hinting at a shift in sentiment. Karen's voice rang out above the crowd, attempting to regain dominance as she tried to rally her supporters. "This is not just about one yard," she exclaimed passionately, gesturing toward me as if I were the source of all chaos. "If we allow this kind of behavior, what kind of neighborhood are we creating? We need to uphold these standards for everyone." Yet despite her fervor, murmurs of dissent began to bubble to the surface. A few neighbors openly questioned her methods for the first time. "But is it really fair to pressure someone new into compliance so quickly?" asked John, a father of two who had previously avoided conflict with Karen. "Aren't we supposed to be a welcoming community?" From that moment on, the balance of power began to tilt. Residents visibly shifted between siding with Karen and supporting the protagonist's push for fairness. I could feel a growing momentum as some neighbors leaned in towards me, their nods indicating support and understanding. While Karen's supporters clung tightly to the status quo, cracks were forming in her once unquestioned authority. The stage was set for a pivotal moment in the neighborhood dynamics. What had begun as a private dispute over property lines had evolved into a community conversation about authority, autonomy, and the values that would ultimately shape their shared lives. As I stood my ground, emboldened by the quiet support around me, I realized that I wasn't just defending my rights, I was also stirring something deeper within this community. As the atmosphere thickened with palpable tension, Karen's carefully curated composure finally crumbled. The moment felt surreal as her facade shattered, revealing a woman teetering on the edge of desperation and outrage. "You think you can just ignore the rules?" she shrieked, her voice rising to an almost unrecognizable pitch. "This isn't just about you. It's about preserving our community." The absurdity of her meltdown was staggering. She began pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly as if conducting an orchestra of chaos. "If we allow this blatant disregard for HOA guidelines, what will happen next? Will we have flamingos in everyone's yard? A carnival in your driveway?" Her words tumbled out in a frantic stream, each more ridiculous than the last, drawing a mix of bewildered expressions and stifled laughter from onlookers. Caught between disbelief and dark amusement, I watched as Karen's rant escalated further. "You," she pointed at me with shaky fingers, "are undermining everything we've worked for. My reputation is at stake here." The sheer irrationality of her claims hung in the air like a bad odor. It was no longer about property lines, it had morphed into a theatrical performance of insecurity and control. Neighbors exchanged glances, some with raised eyebrows, others suppressing smirks as they realized how far Karen had spiraled. Is this really what we want for our community? One resident whispered to another, the skepticism growing louder amidst the chaos. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of empowerment as Karen continued her descent into absurdity. Her meltdown not only revealed her vulnerabilities but also illuminated the cracks in her once unyielding authority. As she flailed against the tide of dissent, I understood that my stand was resonating more powerfully than I had anticipated. This confrontation would now serve as a turning point, not just for me but for all those weary of Karen's reign over the neighborhood. The drama that had unfolded before us was not merely a battle between one homeowner and an HOA president, it was a crucial awakening for a community longing for balance and fairness. In the aftermath of the chaotic confrontation, the neighborhood experienced a palpable shift in dynamics. The once dominant aura surrounding Karen had been fractured, and neighbors began to reassess their perceptions of her authority. Some residents who had previously kept their heads down and avoided conflict now engaged in conversations about change, citing the absurdity of her meltdown as a catalyst for re-evaluating their relationship with the HOA. Curiously, several longtime supporters of Karen approached me with newfound respect. They expressed their surprise at how I had stood my ground and even shared stories of their own frustrations regarding the strict enforcement of rules that had stifled creativity and personalization in their homes. "I never thought I'd see someone challenge her like that," remarked Mrs. Thompson with an appreciative nod, her earlier skepticism towards me replaced by solidarity. The atmosphere among neighbors started to shift from one of fear and compliance to a more open dialogue about community standards. Weekly coffee gatherings that once served as informal meetings quickly transformed into discussions about ideals for a more balanced and inclusive neighborhood governance. In this new environment, voices that had remained silent began to emerge, eager to participate in shaping community norms collaboratively. Yet, not all reactions were supportive of this shift. Karen, facing what she perceived as betrayal from those she had counted on, grew increasingly isolated. She was still attending meetings but her presence felt diminished, her voice lacked the usual dominative edge she had wielded before. Gathering fewer followers for her cause, she no longer commanded the same level of respect, now seen by some as an ineffective leader who could not accept changing sentiments among residents. As weeks passed, it became clear that the incident marked a turning point for the neighborhood, a moment when communities collectively questioned long-held power structures. What began as a dispute over property lines became a foundational event that empowered individual homeowners to speak out against authoritarianism and seek a collaborative approach to governance within their suburban enclave. What had felt like a battle against one person evolved into a collective effort toward creating a sense of fairness and unity that would shape the future of their community. Reflecting on the events that unfolded in our neighborhood, it becomes clear that homeowners associations, HOAs, embody a complex interplay of power and control, often veering into authoritarianism when unchecked. While their stated purpose is to maintain property values and ensure community standards, the reality can sometimes skew towards micromanagement and oppression. In communities like ours, where a single individual can command significant influence, often without adequate checks or balances, the potential for abuse of power becomes alarmingly apparent. The situation with Karen illuminated how easily authority could become tyrannical. Initially, her strict enforcement of rules seemed benign, a way to uphold order in our picturesque neighborhood. However, her behavior revealed a troubling obsession with control that alienated residents and stifled their individuality. As we witnessed her unravel during the confrontation, it became evident that her grip on power was not only fragile but also detrimental to the sense of community she claimed to protect. This incident served as a wake-up call for many residents who had previously accepted Karen's authority as an immutable fact of life. The ensuing dialogues fostered by the confrontation encouraged neighbors to voice their concerns about governance structures within the HOA. It raised critical questions: who truly holds power in our communities? What happens when compliance is prioritized over individual rights and creativity? The aftermath highlighted the need for balance between maintaining standards and allowing personal expression within neighborhoods. A healthy community thrives on open communication and shared decision-making, rather than fear-based compliance instigated by one person's agenda. The experience prompted a shift toward inclusive governance, advocating for systems where all voices are heard and appreciated. Ultimately, this incident was not just about property lines or HOA rules, it became a pivotal moment that challenged long-held assumptions about authority in our neighborhood. It underscored the importance of actively engaging in community governance to prevent any one individual from wielding excessive control, a lesson that could resonate far beyond our own streets. In reflecting on the tumultuous events within our neighborhood, several important lessons emerged from the confrontation with Karen. First and foremost, the importance of personal boundaries became strikingly clear. It is vital for individuals to stand firm in asserting their rights, especially in the face of unreasonable authority. When faced with someone who feels entitled to exert control over our lives, recognizing the need to push back can foster an environment of respect and fairness. This incident served as a powerful reminder that complacency can lead to the erosion of community values. Many residents had previously accepted Karen's grip on power without question, but the confrontation catalyzed a critical awakening. It illustrated that open dialogue is essential for healthy community governance, allowing diverse voices to contribute to the decision-making process. When we allow fear to dictate our actions, we not only inhibit our own freedom but also risk silencing others who may share similar frustrations. Moreover, the situation highlighted the necessity for checks and balances within any governing body, including an HOA. When one individual's authority goes unchallenged, it can morph into authoritarianism that stifles individual creativity and expression. Healthy communities thrive on collaboration and inclusivity, where each resident feels empowered to speak up about their perspectives and needs. Ultimately, this episode reinforced the idea that standing up against unreasonable authority is not merely a personal victory, it can usher in a broader change that benefits the entire community. By reclaiming our voice, we paved the way for a neighborhood culture founded on mutual respect and shared governance. The lessons learned from this encounter remind us that we all have a role to play in shaping our community, ensuring it remains a place where individuality is celebrated and authority is wielded responsibly. In our collective journey toward fairness and understanding, each of us has the power to contribute meaningfully to the fabric of our shared lives.